get started with a little bit of an intro. Welcome everyone to the New West 2023 Federal Budget Breakdown. My name is Alicia Mohammed. I'm a communications consultant at New West, and I'm joined with Monty Solberg, CEO of New West Public Affairs, and Saeed Salvam, who is our Managing Director of Federal and Ontario, who's joining live from Ottawa following the budget lockup. We're all very excited to be here and to be delving into this budget, which was tabled just a couple hours ago by Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. Budget 2023 is in many ways a balancing act. The Liberals have an interesting and complicated role to stay fiscally responsible after years of high spending during the pandemic, while supporting Canadians as we prepare for potentially a recession. Not only are the economic stakes high, but Freeland and the Liberal Party are tasked with keeping Canada competitive in the clean economy and investing in healthcare across the provinces. So before we get started, just want to let people know that if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A function below or in the chat, and we'll try to get to them after we're done our questions here. So without further ado, let's delve in. To begin, Monty, I'd love to know what your initial reaction is to the 2023 federal budget and what stands out to you.
Well, what stands out to me is that there aren't a ton of surprises. It's a budget that contains quite a bit of spending, maybe not as big as some of the budgets in the recent past, but it does go way beyond previous commitments to balance the budget. And the government is now sort of leaving it open a little bit as to when that budget will actually come into balance. So that's a big change. There's no question that spending is up dramatically in all kinds of areas, but areas that were well telegraphed. We, of course, knew the government had, in a way, almost no option but to spend on green initiatives because of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the potential for all kinds of Canadian capital and jobs to end up in the US. And then, of course, there are some of the well-known commitments the government made, for instance, to the NDP for things like the dental plan, which will benefit low-income Canadians, and some other things that were more recently telegraphed, like the grocery rebate and others. So not a ton of surprises. Kind of a typical Liberal budget, I will say. Quite a bit of spending, but you know, they always have their finger on the pulse, and a lot of this will be popular as well.
Saeed, what stands out to you about this budget? What's your gut reaction?
Well, look, this particular budget, especially by a government that is not facing an election anytime soon, or so we think, is, in my opinion, a please don't vote me out budget. It's the type of budget that is catering to as many people as possible, as many different stakeholders as possible, in order to ensure that it continues to get the support from the NDP, which thankfully for them, they did. I think that some of these kitchen table pieces within the budget itself, from the grocery rebate that Monty was alluding to, the predatory lending, the lowering the credit card interchange fees, are all things that are going to resonate with Main Street. But because this is the type of budget that really focuses on individuals, and then also healthcare, and then also clean energy, it's the type of budget where it seems like many stakeholders have a little bit, but there's no one major stakeholder that has a lot.
If I might, Alicia, before we go on, you know, conservatives who are watching this will say, you know, the spending is out of control, and they'll be, you know, disappointed. However, I will just point out that it is often the case that governments end up spending deficit spending, and it takes a long time and some pretty serious consequences before the issue of deficits and debt starts to percolate up and be a real issue in public opinion polling. It's nowhere on the radar right now, and I don't see it being there for a little while. I remember well going into 1995 when I was a young MP, and you know, initially being quite concerned that the government of the day wasn't taking it seriously. Then all of a sudden in 1995, when it became very apparent that spending could not continue the way it was going, all of a sudden it was the big issue. So it takes a long time, takes a lot of deficits before that actually becomes a big issue.
That's a good point, Monty, and it actually leads me perfectly into my next question, which is that Freeland prefaced this budget by centering it around a theme of fiscal responsibility. Saeed, I'd love to know what you think fiscal responsibility looks like in this budget, how that's manifested, and your take on the deficit before we go to Monty once again.
Yeah, I think the big challenge here for the Liberals is, again, that balancing act that they had to play. And when I think they mention fiscal restraint, and it's really about making sure that programs and services are not necessarily the ones that are getting the huge investments. It's more so, again, clean energy, healthcare, some of the bigger and larger areas within the budget. But when you're running a $40.1 billion deficit, which has increased significantly from the last projected deficit in the previous fall statement, it's challenging for a government to actually be in a position to be like, hey, we're trying to do something where we can actually balance the budget. Of course, every government will say that they're trying to, and they have a projected date as to when they want to balance the budget. But I think in this case, because of the sheer amount of spending, that's going to be very challenging for this government.
Yeah, absolutely. Monty, do you have anything to add?
Well, I will just say that, one of the concerns we should have, and that every government should have, is that if things go wrong, and let's face it, we didn't predict a pandemic or a war with Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia a few years ago. We just didn't see any of those things coming. And, we had some reserves at that time. Right now, we're getting down to the point where the cupboard is pretty bare, and it'll be difficult to deal with those kinds of contingencies should they come along. And, I think that's something that we should be somewhat concerned about.
Good point. And in terms of investment, one of the key places that the Liberals are choosing to invest is in clean technology and in a clean economy. Monty, what does this investment look like in reality, and how do you think the provinces will react?
Well, the investment seems to be pretty comprehensive. I mean, there are a lot of new programs or beefed up programs and tax incentives of various kinds, renewable tax credits, investment tax credits, this kind of thing. And that's important. I mean, obviously, the government is reacting to the Inflation Reduction Act, as is the entire world. Europe is there as well. And we have to, because if we don't, companies who can go into the US can mitigate their emissions in the US and raise their funding in the US as opposed to doing it in Canada. And that applies to great swaths of the Canadian economy, whether it's in manufacturing, clean technology, or the oil and gas sector. So it is important that the government step up and provide those incentives, or we will lose a tremendous amount of jobs, revenue, investments, and the government will lose a massive part of their tax base. So that was an important set of initiatives. Whether or not they got the details right, we will have to wait and see, because industry will be speaking up. I will just note that going into this budget, for instance, the Canadian Mining Association, said, okay, great, critical mineral strategy is all good, $3.8 billion. We like it. However, the way it was structured wasn't enough to necessarily encourage the development of an EV industry and battery technology in Canada. And so I'll be very interested in what Pierre Gratton has to say, and others in the sector have to say, about whether or not this budget meets muster.
Absolutely. And you said something really interesting, which a lot of people are picking up on, that this surge of investments is directly related to the US Inflation Reduction Act. Saeed, do you have thoughts on this clean tech investment and how it relates to staying competitive with the US after this huge act that we've seen come out of our neighbors?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that the Deputy Prime Minister has mentioned, they have a solid understanding that it's very difficult to compete with our neighbors to the south. They have a much larger budget. We're talking trillions versus billions. So when it comes to our investments, this was what they're calling a measured response to it. I think they're trying their best to provide these tax credits, and some of them are substantial. When you talk about it in the aggregate, where you include the carbon capture tax credits and the clean hydrogen tax credits, we're talking at close to 80 billion plus in tax credits. So it's quite a bit of money, especially for Canada. But again, you have that the deficit as well. You have the expansion and investment in dental care as well, which was not sort of part of previous announcements. So in terms of the relation to the IRA, I mean, there are certain companies, especially those that are focused on EVs and manufacturing and critical mineral extraction, that could be happy. But one thing that I have found very interesting, particularly in this budget, is that in order to be eligible for some of those tax credits, a lot of these companies have to adhere to some strict labor criteria. They have to ensure that their labor force, in order to get the highest rate, they have to be able to pay a prevailing wage based on union compensation. So that could be considered a bit of a win from the NDP as well. But this is also really similar to what exists right now in the US. So you can see that some of the policies are somewhat similar as they attempt to be as competitive as possible. But again, time will tell in terms of our type of corporate investment that we can attract. And of course, the government is really highlighting that Volkswagen investment in the province of Ontario. We'll see if others follow.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Another big part of this budget and, a big part of political discourse lately is that we're in a cost of living crisis, as some would call it. How, Monty, do you think this budget supports vulnerable Canadians struggling with the rising cost of living? And what's your take on the proposed affordability measures?
Well, I mean, the grocery rebate's the most obvious thing. It is for people who make less than 90,000 a year, as I recall. I believe that's correct. So, that's an immediate help, and that will be, I'm sure, appreciated by a lot of people. The government's put in place other things. Even the dental program will be important to a lot of lower income Canadians and will really help them deal with the cost of that. That's going to be a popular program. I would say, in Canada, we like our teeth clean and our economy green, I guess, is the moral of the story. But they've done other things as well, and that's pretty important. I mean, you see that in all the polling right now. The two biggest issues in Canada when it comes to things that Canadians are concerned about are healthcare and the cost of living. So to some degree, this budget gets at both of those, and therefore, I suspect because we're quite happy to worry about tomorrow. We won't worry about deficits and things like that. People will probably give the budget a pass, and we'll have to wait and see, down the road whether it actually gives the Liberals an actual bump in popular polling.
Absolutely. And Saeed, do you have thoughts? Do you agree with Monty on this, the new Dental Care Act and the other proposed affordability measures?
I think in general, it's a win for Canadians who are facing really tough, inflationary costs. It's just, there's also issues of housing affordability, which is not addressed as aggressively as I think the NDP, for instance, wanted it. There's the Liberals introduced a code of conduct for Canadians with existing mortgages, but again, that doesn't really help in terms of things like interest rates, which is governed, of course, by monetary policy. There's some support for students in terms of student loan payments. There's the predatory lending pieces as well that they're trying to address. So, it seems like a start for Canadians, but at the end of the day, Canadians who are facing challenges and those who are coming from low income backgrounds are facing really difficult, prices at the gas station or with shelter are going to, of course, continue to notice this. The grocery rebate is definitely a good start, but I think many Canadians would think that there is possibly more to be done.
Well, the other big thing, sort of the elephant in the room, of course, is the government's impact itself on creating inflation. And the finance minister did comment on that and did note that they wanted to make their spending targeted so that they didn't actually create more inflation, because overspending by government is a big driver of inflation. I think a lot of people would argue, that to mix my metaphors here, that horse has left the barn, and they have been spending pretty heavily, and it probably has contributed to inflation somewhat. But they're trying hard to leave the impression and create the reality that some people will benefit by this budget because of these targeted measures.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Monty, the two kind of big issues for Canadians right now are affordability and healthcare. Saeed, I'm wondering, are there any announcements of note that stood out to you in the healthcare sphere? And how do you think the Liberals have been doing in terms of combating Canada's, shortage of doctors and nurses, and the strain that's currently on the healthcare industry and on, average Canadians who are trying to visit doctors and hospitals?
I think the biggest announcement is not the one that was made necessarily today, but some previous announcements that were made by the federal government in terms of their new partnerships with provinces. Quite a bit of investment has been made, over $500 million, and in many cases to support hospitals and support provinces as well. So I think it's really up to the provinces in terms of how they decide to supplement. But at the same time, I think a lot of provinces in this particular budget were looking for certain funding that maybe they didn't necessarily get. So I think that's a big challenge. But yet, there's still that $48 billion in new funding for dental care. So again, a balancing act, and one that is really showing itself as, one that's going to be challenging, I think, into the near future, but could set the Liberals up for a more of an election style budget next year.
Yeah, Monty, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
I just have to say that, the biggest, probably the biggest single help we could get when it comes to addressing skill and labor shortages is foreign credential recognition, and being more flexible amongst the various colleges of physicians and surgeons around the country when it comes to inviting people who have practiced in other jurisdictions to practice in Canada. It's easy to say that, it's not easy to do. People expect standards to be met, but there must be a better way right now than the system that we have. And I will note that there are a lot of frustrated Canadians who have gone and got credentialed in other countries who want to come home and practice medicine and just can't. So these things need to be resolved. But, I agree with Saeed. I think a lot of it has to happen at the provincial level, not because, it wouldn't benefit Canadians coast to coast, but because the provinces jealously guard, their right to make those kinds of decisions, and no more so than our friends in Quebec, but also in places like Alberta and other places. And it's just one of those things that provinces ultimately need to agree on, so they can benefit Canadians everywhere.
Yeah. Great points. And in terms of response to the budget so far, Jagmeet Singh said just after the budget was tabled that the NDP will support this budget. Monty, what does this mean for the Liberal Party? What does it mean for Canadian politics as a whole?
Well, the Liberals get to, live to fight another day. And that's, of course, something they're always concerned about. They're not doing well in the polls. There's, some new polling out here recently that indicated Pierre Poilievre actually had a substantial personal lead over Justin Trudeau for the first time since I can remember, when it comes to personal leadership. So, this is not a time for the Liberals to go into an election. At best, I think they could hope for a result that would be very similar to what they have now. But what we do know is that we're going into this period of recession. We're going into a period of great uncertainty. What will the Americans do? And how does that impact Canada? What will the world economy do? Will we ever run into another pandemic? I mean, all these things cause such great uncertainty, and it's much more so the case when you're in a minority government. And so stay tuned. I mean, things change and they change quickly. I'm sure the Prime Minister is glad to have this budget come out because it takes some of the heat off around the issue of Chinese interference in Canadian elections, something that is, I think, definitely been damaging to the Liberal Party. And so, good for them. They get to change the channel and, continue to govern and try and bring forward initiatives that will get people focused on the things they care about, like healthcare and the cost of living, and less so about things Liberals don't want to talk about, like, what happens with the Chinese interference.
Saeed, what do you think of the NDP supporting this budget?
Yeah, no, agreed. I think that at the end of the day, it keeps the Liberals in office. I think that when you hear the NDP voice their approval for this budget, Jagmeet was very quick to sort of take credit for a lot of the measures, and I think that's natural. I think that's as part of the supply and confidence agreement, one of those very unique dynamics that continue to play out, where things like dental care and some of these cost of living pieces like the grocery rebate, they continue to be things that the NDP would take credit for. Of course, the official opposition not wanting to support the budget as well. All these things are to be expected, but the Liberals have to continue to think carefully about what this means for their political future. And I think that when we start considering the next few months into the next year, into the next 2 years, we have to really see a lot of what is announced in the budget come to fruition if they want to continue to enjoy that support from the NDP. And then they also have to ensure that there are no more scandals, no more things of note that could potentially threaten their power. So, while a lot of that may not be necessarily within their control, it is something to keep note of, just given their minority status in the government.
Definitely. And just, before we kind of wrap up this webinar, I just have a couple questions, overview of what we've seen so far. Monty, I'd love to know, we've kind of analyzed clean tech, affordability, the dental care and healthcare. What are the weaknesses of this budget, if any?
Well, I mean, there's always weaknesses in a budget. I don't care how good you think you crafted a budget, there are weaknesses. And in this one, I mean, the most obvious thing is the abandonment of deficit target, or a balanced budget, abandonment of that target, I should say. That's a big weakness, and that will become, or could easily become, relevant, if interest rates stay high for a while, for instance, and people start to watch interest charges mount, and the amount of money from their tax dollars that goes to paying interest continues to grow. That could be a real problem. It's probably down the road somewhere, but that is, something to be concerned about. There are a number of other things that they need to be conscious of. Like, I think the biggest loser in this budget is probably the people in national defense. There was a commitment by the government to buy some F-35s. That's great, but that is clearly only a beginning. The government did make some commitments to spend a bit more money on things like building up our supply of munitions and that kind of thing, which we've suddenly become very aware of with the Russia-Ukraine war. And of course, we've been supplying the Ukrainians to some degree and that kind of thing. So there are always these things that we need to be aware of and worry about. And those are a couple of them, but trust me, there are lots of other sectors that will be plenty disappointed by what they're seeing here. And I'm sure we'll hear about that in the next couple of days.
Saeed, any other weaknesses that jump out at you from the budget?
I think that's going to be the most prominent, is that lack of deficit reduction support. We saw a little bit of that deficit reduction ability with the province of Ontario just last week. So, while there were certain things echoed in this budget, again, with that investment in clean tech and hydrogen and being very responsive to the US IRA, the deficit could be something that again creeps up, as Monty said, and it could become a very big problem should interest rates either continue to hold or potentially rise in the near future. But all in all, I think this is a budget that for the most part has spoken to many of the key stakeholders that the Liberals needed to speak to. But again, we'll see what happens within the coming weeks to months.
Yeah, and just to wrap, you've just said that, the budget appeals to stakeholders. I'm curious, as we just kind of, tie up this conversation, do you feel as though the budget reflects the top priorities for everyday Canadians today? Saeed, I might go to you for that.
Sure. In a recent poll, Canadians, of course, talked about inflation, grocery costs being the top two concerns, and of course, taxes as well. So three. In terms of tax reductions, I mean, there's things like tax credits, some of it mainly to industry, but also to low-income Canadians. So I think there's been a bit of an addressing for that. But again, there's still, challenges with food costs. Like while inflation has reduced for the past 8 months, the cost of food is still very high. The cost of other basic essentials are very high. Gas at least has decreased a bit as well. So I think that, Main Street really needs to see a change if there is going to be a sort of change of feeling when it comes to affordability. But, there's still, of course, work to do. And again, with any budget, it's not perfect, but this is it seems to be a start.
So I will just respond to that and say, measures in a budget tend to be so esoteric and distant from most Canadians. There are exceptions, when the government I was part of cut the GST back in the day, people said, wow, great. We know what that is. We appreciate that. But it's rare to come up with measures that so directly impact Canadians that they go, this is a great budget. Most of the time, it just goes over their head. They're just kind of worried about their own concerns, and to the degree those things come back and impact them down the road, great, they're happy about them, but they aren't going to fixate on the things that are in the budget. I don't think there's, I don't think there are many people would dispute that. I think the biggest thing that can happen is, as Saeed said, when some of this starts to hit, for instance, grocery rebates, that's when I think the government needs to be out there, frankly, pounding the drum and saying, here's what we did for you, and this will help you. But apart from that, a lot of these measures are just going to be things that are promptly forgotten by the general public. I will say the one big aspect of this budget that does probably influence, and I'm not answering your question, Alicia, but I'm going to answer it this way, or I'm going to say this, that the investments when it comes to green energy are probably going to stick around for a long time, irrespective of what government is in place, because we have to respond to what the Americans have done. And so, the names may change and some of the details may change, but generally the drift is probably going to be what the drift is today. So that will be the remarkable thing, I think, about this budget for many, many years to come.
Absolutely, and great point, I think, to kind of end on the impact of this budget on future generations in terms of what our energy landscape looks like, how we compete with different markets, and innovation in clean tech. I think that's definitely a major point of this budget, and something that Canadians and stakeholders are going to latch on to. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in to this budget breakdown. Thanks, Saeed and Monty, for sharing your insights. Stay tuned for New West's budget analysis, which will be out shortly. And if anyone has any questions on, navigating this budget, what it means for you specifically, make sure to reach out to us, and we can set up an individual call. But thank you so much for tuning in, and we will chat with you later.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks, Saeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.